Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. On the morning of June 11, 1920, Marie Larson arrived at the Manhattan brownstone where she worked as a housekeeper. From the outside, nothing seemed especially wrong. The house stood on West 70th Street in a respectable neighborhood of comfortable homes. Larson had her key and the exterior doors were reportedly locked, but when she entered and moved toward the reception room, she found Joseph Bowne Elwell sitting in a chair. Elwell was dressed in pajamas. The morning mail had been brought in and lay beside him, suggesting the day had begun in an ordinary way. But he was slumped and unresponsive, with a gunshot wound in the center of his forehead. There was no weapon in his hand and no gun lying nearby. He was still breathing, though barely conscious, and he could give Larson no explanation for what had happened. Help was summoned, and Elwell was taken for emergency treatment. He never recovered enough to identify his attacker. Later that day he died. The medical examiner concluded that the shooting was a homicide, not an accident and not suicide. That ruling transformed an already disturbing scene into one of New York's most baffling murder investigations. Someone had apparently entered Elwell's home, shot him at close enough range to be deliberate, and disappeared with the gun. Investigators recovered a .45 caliber cartridge case from the room, along with the bullet that had killed Elwell. The weapon itself was missing. That detail mattered. If Elwell had shot himself, where was the gun? And if an intruder had fired the fatal round, how had that person entered and left without attracting attention? Larson insisted that the exterior doors were locked when she arrived, creating the impression of a sealed house. Now, it was not a perfectly sealed room in the storybook sense. The door could lock automatically after someone left, and a visitor might have been admitted willingly. Windows and service entrances also had to be considered. Still, the locked doors shaped the mystery from the beginning. There was no obvious forced entry, no disorder suggesting a frantic search, and no clear escape route that announced itself to detectives. The rest of the room was almost unnervingly calm. Valuables appeared untouched. There was no clear evidence of robbery, and the morning mail remained beside the wounded man. Nothing suggested that a burglar had been surprised and fired in panic. Instead, the arrangement implied a brief, controlled encounter. Perhaps Elwell had known his visitor. Perhaps he had opened the door, returned to his chair, and expected a conversation rather than an attack. So who was Joseph Bowne Elwell? To the public, he was best known as an authority on contract bridge and related card games. He had written about strategy, taught wealthy players, and moved comfortably through fashionable hotels, clubs, and private drawing rooms. Bridge was not simply a casual pastime in those circles. It carried status, competition, money, and ego. Elwell had built a reputation by understanding both the cards and the people holding them. He was also involved in horse racing and owned racehorses, giving him another connection to a world where fortunes could shift quickly. His social life crossed several overlapping circles: wealthy families, theater people, gamblers, racing figures, and married couples whose private relationships were not always simple. By 1920, Elwell was separated from his wife, and newspapers portrayed him as a man with numerous romantic attachments. Some of those reports were credible, others were plainly embellished. That distinction became important because the press descended on the case almost immediately. Elwell's death contained nearly every element editors wanted: wealth, nightlife, an apparently locked house, a missing gun, and whispers about women whose names could fill columns. Reporters competed for revelations. Anonymous sources described jealous husbands, discarded lovers, and secret telephone calls. But publicity did not necessarily produce clarity. In many ways, it buried the reliable evidence beneath layers of rumor. To understand the investigation, we need to go back to Elwell's final evening. On June 10th, he dined at the Ritz-Carlton as part of a social gathering. The hotel was one of the city's most fashionable meeting places, where a person like Elwell could move from dinner into a long night of entertainment without leaving his familiar world. Nothing publicly known about the meal suggested that he expected immediate danger. After dinner, Elwell attended a late theatrical review. Accounts of the exact company around him, and of who traveled with whom afterward, became complicated. Witnesses remembered fragments: a departure time, a vehicle, a companion, or a destination. Yet those fragments did not always agree. The result was a timeline that looked detailed from a distance but became less certain whenever investigators tried to connect one statement to the next. At some point in the early morning hours, Elwell returned to his brownstone. But even that journey produced disputes. Different accounts described how he traveled home and whether he was alone. Some reports placed him with companions for part of the trip. Others suggested he separated from the evening's party before reaching his residence. The differences may have come from faulty memory, embarrassment, or the simple confusion of reconstructing a late night after a shocking death. Then there were the telephone calls. Investigators heard conflicting claims about calls made to or from the house during Elwell's final hours. Some accounts suggested a woman had tried to reach him. Others questioned whether certain calls occurred at all. Telephone records in 1920 could not provide the instant, precise history we expect today. Much depended on operators, household recollections, and witnesses who might have had reasons to protect themselves or someone else. By sunrise, Elwell was apparently awake and dressed only for the morning inside his home. His mail had arrived, and he had brought it into the reception room or allowed it to be brought there. That simple detail narrows the possible sequence. The shooting likely occurred after the mail was available but before Larson entered. It leaves a brief morning window in which an expected visitor or someone able to gain entry could have approached him. The shot itself raised more questions. A .45 caliber pistol was a powerful weapon, and firing one inside a brownstone might be expected to draw attention. Yet there was no dependable report of a neighbor hearing and identifying the gunshot at the crucial time. City streets were noisy even in the morning. Delivery vehicles, doors, engines, and construction could cover a sudden sound. A witness might also hear something without recognizing it as gunfire. Investigators studied the cartridge case and bullet, hoping the ammunition might lead to a particular firearm or owner. But firearms identification was still developing, and there was no comprehensive system that could simply match the evidence to every weapon in circulation. Without the pistol, detectives could establish the general type of ammunition, but not the identity of the person who pulled the trigger. The most valuable physical object in the case had left with the killer. Police also considered the position of Elwell's body and the absence of obvious defensive injuries. He seemed to have been seated when he was shot. If that reconstruction was correct, he may not have perceived the visitor as a threat until the weapon appeared. There was apparently no prolonged struggle, no overturned room, no trail of destruction, and no sign that Elwell had chased or fought his attacker. The encounter may have lasted only moments. Now here's where the investigation widened almost beyond control. Detectives began looking through Elwell's complicated personal life. They interviewed friends, employees, social acquaintances, racing contacts, and people connected to his bridge career. Women who had spent time with him were questioned, so were men who might have resented those relationships. Each interview generated more names, more private grievances, and more stories that could not always be verified. The romantic theory attracted the greatest attention. Elwell had a reputation for pursuing relationships with women, including women who were married. That made jealousy an obvious possible motive. A husband, former partner, or rejected admirer might have wanted revenge, but a plausible motive is not the same as evidence. Police needed to place a suspect inside the brownstone, connect that person to the ammunition, and explain the locked doors. No romantic lead satisfied all of those requirements. His marriage also came under scrutiny. Elwell and his wife had been living separately, and the state of their relationship became public property after his death. Investigators examined family tensions and financial questions, as they would in almost any homicide involving a wealthy victim. But suspicion alone led nowhere. No charge emerged from the marital history. And the public discussion often revealed more about contemporary appetite for scandal than about the actual events inside the house. The racing world offered a different theory. Horse ownership could involve substantial expenses, wagers, debts, and business disagreements. Perhaps Elwell had angered someone over a horse, a bet, or a financial arrangement. Detectives explored those connections, but again, the theory lacked a decisive link to the scene. There was no missing ledger that clearly explained the killing, no documented threat that solved the timeline, and no weapon recovered from a racing associate. Bridge produced its own possibilities. Elwell's expertise gave him access to wealthy clients and private games, some involving significant stakes. Card tables can create grudges, especially when money and pride are involved. Newspapers hinted at cheating accusations and secret losses. But much of that material was speculative. Elwell's prominence in bridge made the game an irresistible part of the story. It did not, however, give police a provable murderer. There was also the possibility that the killer came for a conversation rather than with a fixed plan. Maybe an argument escalated. Maybe the gun was carried for intimidation and then fired. But that theory creates another problem: the placement of the shot. A bullet to the forehead suggests direct aim, not a random discharge during a chaotic struggle. The quiet room and missing weapon point toward someone who retained enough control to leave carefully. Could the shooting still have been self-inflicted? Investigators and the medical examiner rejected that conclusion. The missing pistol was the clearest obstacle, because a person mortally wounded while seated could not reasonably hide the weapon and then return to the chair. The physical findings were treated as consistent with homicide. Unless another person removed the gun after a self-inflicted shot, which would itself require an unexplained visitor, suicide did not fit the complete scene. The locked doors, meanwhile, may have seemed more mysterious than they truly were. If Elwell admitted someone he knew, there would be no forced entry. Depending on the lock, the killer could leave and allow the door to secure behind them. A person familiar with the house might also know another exit. What police could not establish was who had that familiarity, who was present that morning, and why nobody saw the person arrive or depart. As days turned into weeks, witnesses were repeatedly questioned and alibis were compared. Yet the case had begun with a serious disadvantage. Elwell survived the shooting but could not speak. There was no dying declaration, no whispered name, and no description of a visitor. The one person who knew why the meeting occurred was unable to provide even a hint. Every theory, therefore, had to be built from incomplete observations made by other people. Public fascination encouraged false leads. People wrote to authorities with visions, rumors, overheard conversations, and accusations against acquaintances. Sensational cases often produce confessions from individuals who have no connection to the crime. And Elwell's murder was no exception to that broader pattern. Each claim had to be checked. Time spent eliminating an invented suspect was time not spent on evidence, but detectives could not safely ignore a statement that might prove genuine. What remained solid was surprisingly limited. Elwell had been alive after returning from his night out. He was in his home on the morning of June 11th, wearing pajamas with the mail nearby. Someone fired one fatal shot from a .45 caliber weapon. The cartridge case and bullet stayed behind while the pistol disappeared. Valuables were not taken, obvious forced entry was absent, and the doors were locked when Larson arrived. Everything beyond those points became less certain. The exact route home, the last confirmed person to see him, the significance of the telephone calls, and the identity of any morning visitor remained disputed. That uncertainty prevented investigators from fixing a reliable final timeline. And without a reliable timeline, they could not use opportunity to separate the genuinely possible suspects from the merely interesting ones. No one was ever charged with Elwell's murder. The case eventually moved from the front pages into American crime fiction. Writer Willard Huntington Wright, using the name S.S. Van Dyne, drew on elements of the mystery for his novel, The Benson Murder Case. The fictional story was not a literal solution to Elwell's death, but readers could recognize the basic image. A wealthy man found shot in a private room, surrounded by clues that seemed both obvious and impossible. Van Dyne's detective fiction then helped shape the genre that followed, including the creation of Ellery Queen by cousins Frederick Dane and Manfred B. Ley. So the influence traveled indirectly, from an unsolved Manhattan homicide to a fictional investigation, and from there into one of detective literature's most enduring characters. The real killer was never identified, but the structure of the mystery survived because it seemed designed for a puzzle novel, and yet the real case resists the neatness of fiction. There is no final chapter in which every visitor is assembled and one overlooked clue explains the locked doors. The missing gun and the morning mail. There is only Marie Larson entering the quiet brownstone, Joseph Elwell unconscious in his chair, and a brief span of time no witness could fully reconstruct. More than a century later, that missing morning remains the heart of the mystery. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.